Buonasera a tutti, and good morning to those of you in the United States. Sono Sheila Weir, sono una diplomatica presso l'Ufficio Public Affairs dell'Ambasciata Americana qui a Roma. Grazie per essere qui con noi per un episodio della serie Transatlantic Thursdays. Today, parliamo di Women's Rights Movement's 100th Anniversary of the Woman's Right to Vote, organizzato dall'Ambasciata degli Stati Uniti e dai consolati di Milano, Napoli e Firenze. Vi invitiamo a partecipare attivamente. Potete scrivere le vostre domande nei commenti. Oggi sono molto lieta di presentare la nostra ospite speciale, Dr. Marjorie Spruill, che parlerà del movimento suffragista degli anni 20 fino alle proteste degli anni 70 e degli eventi più recenti. Nel 2020 si celebra l'anniversario del diritto al voto delle donne negli Stati Uniti. Dr. Spruill è professoressa emerita di storia presso the University of South Carolina ed autrice di molti libri sui movimenti delle donne. Divided We Stand, The Battle Over Women's Rights, Family Values That Polarized American Politics, and One Woman, One Vote, Rediscovering the Women's Suffrage Movement, tra gli altri. Welcome, Dr. Spruill. Vorrei salutare anche la professoressa Tiziana De Maio dell'Università LUMSA di Roma, la professoressa Alessandra Gissi dell'Università Orientale di Napoli, la professoressa Valentina Villa dell'Università Cattolica di Milano, la professoressa Pia Masiero dell'Università Ca' Foscari di Venezia, la professoressa Giovanni Covi dell'Università degli Studi di Trento, la professoressa Modugno e il professore Fiorentino, direttore del Dipartimento di Scienza Politica dell'Università di Roma. Tra quest'ultimo è stato fondamentale per l'organizzazione di questo evento. I'm very happy that I got through all those names without too long. Benvenuti a tutti. And now I'd like to switch to English as I make a few more announcements. Però state attenti, perché sto annunciando una gara molto importante. I would like to announce the new photography exhibit or contest for Italian middle and high school students to commemorate the 100-year anniversary of women's rights to vote in the United States. Students from all over Italy are encouraged to celebrate the activists and the movements that led to women's right to vote by taking a photo and writing captions about an inspiring woman they know and a photo representing the principles and values that they would be willing to fight for today. More information is available in the chat or on the web or on our webpage. The best photos will be included in an exhibit that will be opening next March at the Casa Internazionale delle Donne of Rome, and the schools of the winning students will receive prizes. Again, I strongly encourage everyone to participate, not only women, but also men. The contest will close February 15th, and their winners will be announced in March during Women's History Month to coincide with the Women's Suffrage photo exhibit at the Casa delle Donne. Before Dr. Spruill begins her presentation, I would like to welcome Professor Daniele Fiorentino to say a few words. Dr. Fiorentino is professor of the U.S. History and chair of the Department of Political Sciences at the University of Rome, and director of the Italian Center for the Study of Euro-American History and Politics. He has an extensive background in Italian-American history. Welcome, Professor Fiorentino.
Thank you, Sheila. Thank you all. It's a great pleasure to be here with you today. Our department works a lot on American studies, on United States history. I myself am a professor of United States history. which I've been teaching for over 20 years. And I also studied and actually started my career in academia in the United States many, many years ago. And now I'm here teaching Italian students American politics and American history. It's a great pleasure to be able to participate in this program. I have to thank also my colleague, Roberta Adelaide Modugno. She's joining us shortly. By the way, she was teaching her class on gender politics in international affairs, so she will be able to join us shortly. But I want to thank above all Marjorie Spruill for giving us this opportunity to our students, but to us as well. As scholars, of course, we know her work. We've always appreciated her commitment to women's studies and to United States history and politics. Today, as you said, it's a very, this year is a very important year because it's the anniversary of the 19th Amendment that gave the vote to women in the United States, especially in an election year. And I think this year it's important as ever. The vote of women will play, I think, a major role. We have been observing and following with our students, many of whom are connected with us today, the relevance and the orientation of women's vote in the United States, which I believe plays a major role, especially in these elections. And I think the background and the information and the knowledge Marjorie can give our students will add their knowledge and understanding of the electoral process and on how things will develop in this very interesting and very contended election of 2020. Thank you again. Thank you to the embassy. I must thank your office especially. Sheila, I hope you allow me to call you Sheila. I've been working with the American Embassy for a long time. Actually, I also served in the cultural office for about 10 years, many years ago, because your commitment to American studies and to our projects really makes the spread of American studies in Italy and the understanding of the United States an opportunity to many students across the country. So thank you, and we are all ears. We want to know what Marjorie has in store for us. So have a good day.
Thank you, Dr. Fiorentino. We're thrilled that you could join us today. And Marjorie, I'd like to pass the microphone over to you. And
all right.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you very much. I am so sad that the circumstances prevented me from being there with you in person in your beautiful country that I love so much and that I visited so many times. And Daniele, it's wonderful to see you. I remember the first time I ever met you at that wonderful coffee shop in Rome when I was there with my husband, Don Doyle.
Always a pleasure, Marjorie.
But I'm pleased that the wonders of this technology we're all trying to master is allowing me to be with you to talk to you about the women's rights movement in the United States in this year in which we are, as you say, paying so much attention to that. And I love that little video that you had there at the beginning. So yes, I'm talking about the women's rights movement, but I am going to focus in this talk, of course, on the women's suffrage movement. Americans sometimes, let's see, hold on, we have technical difficulty. I am not seeing my slides. Fabio?
Perhaps you can click on it, the slideshow again, so it comes forward in front of your view.
Okay. Yes, there we are. Okay. So we are talking about the women's suffrage movement. When we're talking about the women's rights movement in the United States, we sometimes refer to this as a way of shorthand as the first wave. The second wave, of course, began later in the 1960s and resulted in lots of reforms that created many opportunities for women, just really changed the world for us. Certainly, I wouldn't be sitting here today as a university professor had we not had that movement and made all the amazing changes that we did. So I'll be happy later in the Q&A to talk to you about this, about the women's rights movement in the modern period and about the elections, whatever. But today, of course, the focus is on this 100th anniversary and about the long road to gaining the 19th Amendment ratified 100 years ago. Gaining this amendment took so many years and so much hard work by several generations of suffragists. Some of the women who were in it and fought the hardest did not live to see the victory. And that included the most famous American suffragist, Susan B. Anthony, who died in 1906. Late in life in 1894, confident that the movement would eventually succeed, she said this: "We shall someday be heeded, and when we shall have our amendment to the Constitution of the United States, everybody will think it was always so, just exactly as many young people think that all the privileges, all the freedom, all always were hers. They have no idea how every single inch of ground that she stands upon today has been gained by the hard work of some little handful of women of the past." Just love that. Seems so perfect for now. So during this centennial year, my goal as a historian of these subjects is to spread the word about this hard work by these women of the past. And in speaking with you today, I'm also eager to tie this to some marks about the United States history and our structure of our government, which explains exactly why getting the right to vote for women took American women so many years. And also, by the end, I want to encourage everyone fortunate enough to live in a democracy to appreciate this right and to vote in this and every election. The date usually given for the start of the U.S. women's suffrage movement is 1848. In that year, several hundred women and a few men came together in the small town of Seneca Falls, New York, to discuss women's rights, or the lack thereof, and vote to issue a public call for votes for women. Carrie Chapman Catt, the great general of the American suffrage movement at its end, who was also president of the International Woman Suffrage Alliance, considered this meeting to be the beginning not only of the U.S. women's suffrage movement, but of the international women's suffrage movement. If indeed the international suffrage movement began in the U.S., many other countries nevertheless extended the right to vote to women well before us. Italy came a bit slightly later in terms of partial suffrage. Then there's an interesting story about Catt speaking with Mussolini in 1923 that may have had something to do with that, and about full suffrage after World War II. The suffrage movement in the United States took so long, from this first call for the vote in 1848 to ratification of the 19th Amendment in 1920, in part because we have this federal system of government in which many decisions are made by the states. As the founding fathers came together to establish a constitution, they left the issue of deciding who could vote to the states. So while suffrage advocates in many nations had one parliament or one assembly to convince, suffragists in the United States had to fight this battle over and over again in the many states that make up the Union. Though 15 states enfranchised women before 1920, and several more granted partial voting rights, such as the right to vote for president or in primary elections. Many states refused to grant women the vote at all. And thus, for there to be full voting rights for all women of the United States, it was necessary to gain the amendment to the US Constitution. And amending the Constitution is very difficult to do. You may already know this, but these are the steps involved. The Founding Fathers, by the way, wanted to make it hard to change the Constitution. They deliberately made it difficult to change it. Though they wanted it to be a flexible document, they wanted additions to be possible. It was also their intention to prevent any revisions or additions that lacked strong support and from all across the nation. And so therefore, to succeed, amendment had to have the approval of 2/3 of each House of Congress and to be ratified by 3/4 of the states. And in addition to the constitutional and political challenges that stood in their way, suffragists also had to change ideas about woman and woman's place in society and her place not being in politics that were very widespread and continued to hold on stubbornly for a long time, in which we see some traces today. And changing these ideas is very difficult. Most people considered women to be unsuitable as voters, not only irrational, but too emotional, just not suited for politics. In the early 19th century, people were increasingly speaking of women as more moral and religious than men, but this idea even was turned against them. Suffrage opponents insisted that women must not be exposed to this sordid world of politics and corruption, that women should remain in the home where they could be protected. In the 1820s, as states began to allow a larger group of men to vote, including men who did not own property, women were still not allowed to engage in politics or vote or hold property. Now, how did it begin and where? The movement originated in the northeastern United States during a period in which many people were trying to reform the nation. Many women began speaking out for women's rights when their efforts to participate fully in the great reform movements of the day, most notably the movement to end slavery, were severely criticized as inappropriate for their sex. Living here in Charleston, South Carolina, I'm particularly proud of these two, who were among the earliest, the Grimke sisters of Charleston, South Carolina, Sarah and Angelina. They came from a prominent slaveholding family, but left their privileged existence to go north and live among Quakers in Philadelphia. And they did this because of their passionate opposition. In the 1830s, they began traveling as agents of anti-slavery organizations and speaking out, and increasingly as people were so eager to hear them, more and more men as well as women came. Ultimately, Angelina's addressing the Massachusetts legislature on the issue of whether or not it's appropriate for women to engage in public affairs. So speaking in public at the time was just considered outrageous. And even men who were within their movement were opposed to this out of fear that it was going to hurt the cause. There was one point where Angelina was speaking in a Philadelphia hall, newly built at great expense by the Female Anti-Slavery Association of Philadelphia. And it was attacked by a howling mob, which as the women left the building, then burned it to the ground. That would be rather discouraging, I think. Both sisters wrote about women's rights. My hero, the late U.S. Supreme Court Justice Ruth Bader Ginsburg, was a big fan of the Grimkes. In fact, she quoted Sarah in her first Supreme Court case, Frontiero versus Richardson, in 1973. Again, asking no special favors, just justice and opportunity. The two women who set up the women's rights movement, set up this first Women's Rights Convention in Seneca Falls, Elizabeth Cady Stanton and Lucretia Mott also ran into difficulties participating in the anti-slavery movement. They first met in London, where they had gone for the World Anti-Slavery Convention, arriving only to find that women were excluded from the proceedings. In 1848, they organized this now iconic gathering, where the participants adopted the Declaration of Sentiments, demanding a wide range of reform. Suffrage was only one of the issues that was discussed, and it was considered to be the most controversial. And only powerful urging by Elizabeth Cady Stanton and the former slave and famous anti-slavery orator Frederick Douglass, a newspaper editor who lived in nearby Rochester, convinced them to include it, and many participants refused to sign. Other women who became prominent leaders of the women's movement early in its history included Susan B. Anthony, seen here in a rare picture of her when she was a young person and not in profile, and Lucy Stone. They were not there at Seneca Falls, but they quickly became involved. As the women's movement took off, it was an interracial movement. Sojourner Truth, a woman who had escaped from slavery in New York, became one of the star orators of the women's rights movement and the anti-slavery movements. Unlike Sojourner Truth, most of the African-American women in the women's movement in these years were middle-class women who had been born free in the North. These included Harriet Fortin Purvis, who was very active in the Underground Railroad along with her husband. This Frances Harper, who was a fabulous poet, as well as abolitionist and suffragist, teacher, public speaker, and a writer. And on the left, someone you might be especially interested in, Sarah Rimond. She was an international activist for human rights and women's suffrage, and she went to Italy in 1867 to pursue medical training in Firenze, where she became a physician and practiced medicine for 20 years in Italy, never returning to the United States, and dying in Florence at the age of 68. And I have to say, Sheila, as you were discussing these projects that young people might be taking up and during the coming year, that seems like a very good one for somebody. The early women's rights movement, however, was clearly not it was clearly a regional movement, not a nationwide movement. In the decade before the Civil War, as they began to hold more and more of these women's rights conventions, they were through the Northeast and the Midwest. But in the South, Southern white people disdained the movement as a spinoff of the anti-slavery movement. The Grimke's works were burned in Charleston, and their mother was told, didn't make it clear to them that if they ever returned to the South, that they would be arrested. During the war, white and Black women's rights advocates focused on making it a war to free the slaves. They formed the Women's National Loyal League, through which they gathered signatures on petitions calling for a constitutional amendment to abolish slavery. Their work was considered to be very important in building the political capital necessary for Lincoln and Congress to go forward with the 13th Amendment. When the war ended, the women's movement began to focus more and more on the vote. The women involved in the early women's movement all believed in universal suffrage for all. They were not trying to get the suffrage just for themselves. Many of the most progressive men in the anti-slavery movement supported them, especially Frederick Douglass. But after the war, the Republicans who were in control of Congress, eager to push through measures to protect the former slaves, or rather enable them to protect themselves by having citizenship and the vote, went forward on amendments that did not include women's suffrage. The 14th and 15th Amendment established the right of citizenship of all and to African Americans. The Dred Scott decision had made it clear that they were not citizens. And so this was super important. But interestingly, in enforcement clause of the 14th Amendment, which stated that states that violated it would lose part of their representation to Congress. It specified that they would lose that if they denied male citizens the vote. And the suffragists were just alarmed that in addition to everything else, the word male had now been added to the Constitution for the first time. But with racial prejudice so strong in the nation, and in the North and the West, as well as the South, advocates for these amendments knew that it was going to be extremely hard to get the requisite number of states, remember, 3/4, to ratify these, to vote, to approve issuing the vote to Black men. And they believed that adding women's suffrage, which was still so controversial, would just make that impossible. And even Frederick Douglass, who passionately believed in women's suffrage, begged them to understand. It was, as Wendell Phillips, one of their former allies who is now saying, suspend your operations and wait a generation, said, this is the Negro's hour. And the woman's hour, they said, would ultimately come. So the issue of what to do tore the women's movement apart. And I don't want to get into the weeds about who was where and all, but suffice it to say that suffragists divided over the issue of whether or not to support ratification under these circumstances, and also about how to go forward, winning the vote for women. And they tried a number of different approaches to winning the vote. In the early 1870s, the National Women's Suffrage Association, led by Stanton and Anthony, tried a new departure in which they demanded suffrage through the federal courts. And many women went to the polls demanding to vote. Some hoped to be arrested and tried, and to defend themselves in court by insisting that this newly adopted 14th Amendment actually established citizenship of all and protected the voting rights of all citizens, including women. In 1872, Anthony, hoping to become the test case for this strategy, was arrested and indicted, and I love this, for, quote, knowingly, wrongfully, and unlawfully voting for a representative to the Congress of the United States. Interestingly, this past summer, as part of the recognition of the suffrage centennial, President Trump officially pardoned Susan B. Anthony for illegal voting in the presidential election of 1872. Now, Anthony's case did not make it all the way to the Supreme Court. When her lawyer paid her fine for her, that ended her case, and she was furious. But another suffragist, Virginia Minor of St. Louis, succeeded in getting the issue before the court. However, in a very important Supreme Court case in 1874, Minor versus Happersett, the Supreme Court ruled that citizenship did not automatically confer the right to vote, and that the 14th Amendment did not prevent any state from excluding women. And so this was super important because it meant that each state could continue to decide on its own to extend the vote to women or to deny it. And it meant that women perhaps would have to seek their own constitutional amendment, which is exactly what they did. The federal women's suffrage movement was first introduced in 1878, containing the same language as the bill that ultimately would become the 19th Amendment, prohibiting denial of voting rights to citizens, quote, on account of sex. But of course, to get that amendment, an amendment that would force all states to enfranchise women, you first had to persuade a large number of states to adopt women's suffrage on their own. So for another half century, women went to work begging men in every state to enfranchise them, but with the final goal of getting enough pro-suffrage states that they could ultimately get their amendment. Anthony explained it this way, speaking in the 1880s, quote, I don't know the exact number of states we shall have to have, but I do know that there will come a day when that number automatically and resistlessly acts on the Congress of the United States to compel the submission of a federal suffrage amendment. And as you see here, after the victory, suffragists added it all up, and they found that between the Civil War and the victory of the 19th Amendment, they had been forced to conduct hundreds of campaigns before they finally achieved victory. It is exhausting just to read the list. However, they had an unexpected success that came from a very unlikely source, from the wild and woolly West, as this postcard said. They were shocked when several Western states, some of them still territories, not only enfranchised women, but at times fought Congress for the right to do so. And Wyoming, still a territory, in 1869 led the nation in the adoption of women's suffrage. And even more surprising was that the Mormon stronghold of the territory of Utah, where they were practicing polygamy or plural marriage, was also among the first parts of the United States to grant women's suffrage, adopting it in 1870. The states of Colorado and Idaho were next. The women from these states organized into the Rocky Mountain Women's Suffrage Association, posing here with Anthony, were justly proud of their region, because at that time, this was the only place in the world where women could vote. Historians differ about why the West was so precocious in its adoption of the women's suffrage idea, but most stress practical politics. In Wyoming, the leading men, sparsely populated territory, thought that enfranchising women would attract national attention. In fact, be somewhat of a marketing gimmick, leading people to move west. Plus, they hoped that it would attract women who would help to civilize the place, like in a good Western movie, to come out, build schools, churches, make the men behave, bear children, and enlarge the population. And in Utah, again, battling Congress in order to be able to keep plural marriage, Mormon leaders hoped that enfranchising women would convince Easterners Mormon women were not downtrodden slaves, and it would tip the balance of power in their favor in their power struggle with non-Mormons, the miners, the cowboys, the prospectors, the railroad construction workers, etc., who tended not to have women with them. So the point of all this is that these Western victories really picked up the sagging spirits of the suffragists nationwide, but it also taught them one of the most important lessons that they would ever learn about politics. And that is that politicians might not be won over by arguments for justice of women's suffrage, but they could be won over if suffragists could show them some reason that they or their party or their group would benefit from giving women the vote, that an expediency argument would always be necessary. The Western victories also made it clear that women's suffrage now had support beyond the Northeast, and that it was no longer only the cause of radicals. In fact, during this time, in the 1880s, the movement caught a huge break when the largest women's voluntary organization in the world endorsed women's suffrage. In the 1880s, the Women's Christian Temperance Union, its leader converted to women's suffrage, bringing with her all this huge number of conservative Christian women frustrated that politicians seemed to be listening only to the liquor industry and not to them, and women convinced that working for suffrage was their Christian duty. For the suffrage movement, again, trying to gain support in all parts of the nation, it helped that the WCTU had chapters in nearly every American community. And by the way, the WCTU at that time also had members in 21 other countries. And in fact, in the late 19th century, when several other countries adopted women's suffrage ahead of us, the WCTU had a lot to do with it, particularly in the first two, New Zealand and Australia, where the WCTU contributed greatly to the victory. The endorsement also, of course, brought the suffrage movement major enemies, as the liquor industry poured its considerable resources into resisting women's suffrage and would continue to do so to the bitter end. So moving along, as the next century approached, the suffragists got together, putting aside differences, united in the National American Woman Suffrage Association that I shall call the National. And under Anthony's leadership, prepared for what turned out to be 3 more decades of struggle. Anthony's strategy was, we are going to be a single issue movement. We are going to focus on one goal, at least the national itself, gaining the vote for women. After that, they would have the power to do other changes. They knew that to win the federal amendment again, they had to win a lot more states and beyond the West. The biggest problem, and I want to talk about this a minute, was the South, the region of the country where the women's suffrage movement would always meet the most resistance and have the least success. I recently published an online article for the Women's Suffrage Centennial Commission about the South and women's suffrage that I'll send you links to. It's called Nemesis, which in English, of course, means the bitter enemy that works furiously to oppose you and never lets up. Yet, as the suffrage leader from Kentucky, Laura Clay, one of the earliest prominent leaders in the southern states, warned national leaders, you can work for 50 more years and get nowhere unless you bring in the South. I've written, my first book was about this, about the South. The key issue, of course, was race. White Southerners already hated the suffrage movement because of its abolitionist roots. Now, in the late 19th century, they were trying to regain control over politics. They regarded the 15th Amendment as unconstitutional, insisting that Congress had pushed this on them during Reconstruction while there were national troops, armed troops there, insisting that Black men could vote. They said that this was a huge violation of federal power. So they were trying to figure out how to keep Black men from voting without violating the 14th or 15th Amendment and having their representation in Congress cut. So the suffragists came up with an expediency argument to fit the occasion. This is a dark chapter in the history of the movement. In the 1890s, the white suffragists tried to convince these Southern politicians that they should not take the vote away from Black men and risk having their delegations to Congress cut. Instead, they said, just enfranchise women. Since there are more white women in the South than the North than Black, it will guarantee white supremacy. Now, this didn't work. As one white Mississippi politician said, Southern men refused to cower behind the petticoats of women and use lovely womanhood to maintain white supremacy. Instead, they found other means to do so that were very important in U.S. politics. These were things that did not involve the destruction of women's traditional role. These were things that, like requirements to vote, including poll taxes, taxes on voting that made it way too expensive for most Black men or whites for that matter. Literacy tests at a time when most Black adults could not read, or the infamous understanding clauses, tests in which applicants to vote were required to explain the meaning of some part of the Constitution or any other questions put to them by the white registrar, who could then promptly declare they had failed and turn them away. But the Congress and the Supreme Court allowed the Southern states to get away with this in the 1890s and then for another half of a century. So for the rest of the suffrage movement, the South would continue to be a problem. The interracial quality of the original suffrage movement was virtually lost. Some of the older suffragists who had fought against slavery had now passed on, and younger women who had not had that experience came into the movement. Some interracial friendships survived, others did not. I think it's marvelous that despite all their differences, Susan B. Anthony was invited to eulogize Frederick Douglass at his funeral. White suffragists were not all alike on race. Some were extreme racists who opposed Blacks ever voting. Others thought literacy tests were okay as long as the nation had public schools. and people, and being illiterate was a temporary condition. And others hated to compromise their values, but did so anyway, knowing that at this period in American history, their movement was never going to succeed if suffrage leaders and organizations openly endorsed equal suffrage for African Americans. And hence it was a strange and ironic parallel to what had happened after the Civil War, when supporters of African American suffrage believed they had no chance of victory if women's suffrage was included. For years, white Southern congressmen blocked the amendment in Congress, but suffragists had to have votes from at least some of them. So white suffragists began excluding African American women from white suffrage groups and distancing the suffrage movement from advocacy of the rights of African Americans. Now, despite this and all their disappointment in their white colleagues, African American women saw this as their cause too. They continued to support the movement, mostly working through African American women's clubs or establishing suffrage clubs. Prominent African American suffragists included the famous Ida B. Wells Barnett, who became internationally known as a crusader against lynching, one of the founders of the NAACP, Mary Church Terrell, the first president of the very influential National Association of Colored Women, also a founder of the NAACP, and she worked hard to build support for suffrage among African Americans. Incidentally, she was a very well-educated woman who had studied in Europe, fluent in several languages, sometimes chosen to represent American suffragists at international congresses. So the new century gets underway, the movement seems stalled, Anthony is retired, then died, a suffrage martyr, and the woman in charge for the first 15 years, Dr. Anna Howard Shaw, was a splendid orator, witty, very persuasive, but ineffective organizer, and there were no state victories during those years. But then a new reform movement swept the nation that had a major positive impact on the women's suffrage movement and contributed greatly to the victory. Because of its impact on motivating women to become suffragists, motivating men to support them, and providing what the floundering movement badly needed, a new expediency argument. By 1910, the progressive movement, which began around 1900 at the grassroots level, swept both national political parties, proved to be a tremendous help to the cause of women's suffrage. Progressives in both parties wanted to see stronger, honest government that would act boldly to address major problems. They supported reforms to clean up city, state, national politics and protect the health and safety of citizens. Imagine that. In all sections of the U.S., including the South, the women's suffrage movement drew support from men and women who supported progressive reforms, including abolishing child labor, protecting women workers, public health programs, and legislation to curb political corruption. In fact, the latter was one of the great fears of many of the politicians, as this political cartoon shows the corrupt politicians fleeing as Madam enters with her broom. One of the things that was remarkable was that the goals of the progressive movement fit perfectly with prevailing ideas about woman's nature. And while some suffragists did not like resorting to this arguments, it was very widespread through this period that if women were going to have all these responsibilities in the home, the place of woman is in the home, but merely to stay there is not enough. She needs the government as her ally, and she needs to be able to decide on laws, as you see it's saying here, that it was woman's nature to vote for progressive reform. Progressives believed that women tended to be more nurturing, compassionate, honest, and would vote for the kind of strong, compassionate government that they endorsed. And in fact, in my book, One Woman, One Vote, new edition coming out in March, by the way, women, I argue that women eventually won the vote, not as much because people's ideas about woman's nature had changed, but because Americans were changing their ideas about the nature and purpose of government, wanting government to be protective, passionate, and compassionate and moral. But just as the WCTU endorsement made the liquor industry fear and fight women's suffrage, the idea that women would support progressive reforms also provoked opposition. The liquor industry used its powerful influence quietly behind the scenes, again, to persuade politicians against suffrage. Around 1912, at the height of the progressive movement, the movement really takes off. Increased support for suffrage resulting from the progressive movement and this new set of victories in the Western states seemed to breathe new life into suffragists all over the country. They still faced tough battles ahead, and there was no progress in the South, but most high-ranking suffragists thought they had not yet reached that point where they had enough states to win support for a federal amendment in Congress. But some suffragists started to get impatient, saying, let's just drop all this state work. And again, like in the 1870s, focus on getting a federal amendment. And this was the point of view of what became known as the more militant suffragists of the United States, led by Alice Paul, this young woman who had studied in London and been very impressed by the militant suffragists that she had met, who, and by the way, militant suffragists in Britain embraced the title suffragettes. In the United States, they never did. It was only a term that was used by their detractors and opponents to belittle them. And in fact, if I don't do anything else during the centennial year, I want to convince our press and politicians to quit calling them suffragettes. But at any rate, I digress. Paul demonstrated with them, even went to jail with them, even engaged in hunger strikes with them. She at first, coming back to the United States, volunteered her services to the National, and she was brilliant at organizing. She organized a famous, spectacular suffrage parade in D.C. on the eve of Woodrow Wilson's inauguration with around 8,000 peaceful demonstrators wearing outfits representing their group or wearing white took part. And you see here an actual photo, and then the same scene in the wonderful TV movie, Iron-Jawed Angels, which I recommend, a great film with actress Hilary Swank playing Alice Paul. Unfortunately, many of the observers, many men in the crowd, many of them drunk and hostile to the suffragists, attacked the marchers. They eventually had to bring out the U.S. cavalry to stop this, as the police turned their backs and did nothing. But to Paul's delight, this led to increased sympathy for the movement, especially because many members of Congress had wives and daughters and sisters that were among the marchers, and launched a major congressional investigation. By 1914, there was another schism in the suffrage ranks as the militants split from the National. The National was furious at some of their tactics, including picketing the White House, which was not rarely done then and certainly shocking when done by women. But the most shocking thing the militants did was to continue picketing the White House even after the U.S. entered the World War, and criticism of the president and the government was not tolerated. As Wilson spoke of the war as a war to promote democracy, they tried to embarrass him before the world. And here you see their most inflammatory act, calling him Kaiser Wilson, whereupon soldiers and sailors attacked them and pulled down their banners. The Wilson administration eventually jailed many of them with long sentences under pretty terrible conditions and even some violent attacks. They demanded to be treated as political prisoners, but were not, and had to wear these prison uniforms, etc. Some, including Paul, went on hunger strikes and were forcibly fed. Finally, as the word leaked out, the outcry from the public forced the Wilson administration to back down and release them, again, gaining for Alice Paul and her supporters valuable publicity and considerable sympathy. Meanwhile, the National continued its work under the great General Carrie Chapman Catt.
Hi, Marjorie.
we're wrapping up.
We have a lot of questions in the chat room that several people would like
Okay.
to answer. So not sure if you could maybe wrap up the presentation in 5 minutes and then we'll get to the questions.
Can do. I'm getting close. Okay.
Thank you.
So under Kat, they can continue their work. She had returned to the presidency. She launched a major coordinated plan coordinating the efforts of the suffragists all over the country and trying to gain Wilson support and running a massive, very effective lobbying effort in Congress. Hoping to win favor with the public and Wilson, she put aside her own pacifism and the national urge suffragists to throw themselves very publicly into war work, even funding a woman's overseas hospital in France. Finally, they got Wilson to endorse the amendment, a huge victory. He addressed Congress asking them to approve the amendment, but they still didn't have enough votes and still had to get a few more in the November elections, whereupon the pandemic hit. And then, like now, it had a huge impact on what people were able to do in terms of political campaigning. But luckily, in the November elections, they managed to defeat a few congressional enemies and elect a few new friends, which meant that finally the amendment was approved by Congress, had that 2/3 vote in each house, and then it was sent on to the states for ratification. Once again, suffragists headed for the states, having to fight now for ratification. It was easy in some places and impossible in others. Right away, Illinois and Wisconsin competed for the honor of being the first state to ratify, while Georgia and Alabama scrambled to be the first to pass a rejection, denouncing it as dangerous, unnecessary, and unwarranted. The South continued to resist, denouncing this and saying that approval of the 19th Amendment was tantamount to consenting to the 15th, which no true son or daughter of the South could do. When Mississippi voted against ratification, the Jackson newspaper celebrated the defeat, proclaiming, quote, "The vile old thing is as dead as its author, Susan B. Anthony, that old advocate of social equality and intermarriage of the races, and Mississippi will never be annoyed with it again." Gives you some idea. Finally, by the summer, one more state was needed. Elections are coming up. There are no legislatures going to meet. High drama. President Wilson, eager for his party to be on the right side of the issue, pressures Democratic governors to call special sessions. Governor Roberts of Tennessee complied, and therefore the final battle took place in Nashville in the long, hot summer of 1920. A bitter struggle over ideology and influence, and the suffragists watched with dismay as men pledged to support ratification mysteriously switched sides. And they were very uncertain when the vote finally took place. But famously, this guy is so famous in the US right now, Tennessee ratified the result of this 24-year-old legislator from the mountains, Harry Byrd, changing his vote at the insistence of his elderly mother. Even then, the antis didn't give up. Using parliamentary tricks, they delayed a revote. Finally, they were able to reaffirm it. The supporters managed to rush it then to Capitol, where the Secretary of State was awakened in the middle of the night to sign this before the antis could get an injunction or otherwise delay. And so finally, on August 26, the federal amendment they had fought for went through. In conclusion, it was long and arduous. No wonder they felt exhausted upon the victory. The movement changed over time in response to changes in American society and politics, and its history thus is complex and fascinating. The movement exhausted generations of leaders who devised and revised strategies and tactics to fit the changing times. The suffrage story is one that includes a record of harmony and cooperation between diverse groups of suffragists and a disturbing record of discrimination and betrayal, of racism, along with idealism, persistence, and courage. The adoption of the 19th Amendment was not a complete victory. Many women remained disfranchised. All American women who were citizens were given the vote, but not all would be allowed to claim it. Outside the South, African American women voted, but most lived in the South, and they were prevented from voting by these same barriers constructed to keep Black men away from the polls. It required another movement for voting rights before they were able to vote. A major goal of the civil rights movement in the 60s, of course, was to remove those barriers. And many women and men, including the great Fannie Lou Hamer of Mississippi, who testified to Congress, she didn't know that she even had the vote until she was in her 40s. She struggled against great odds, enduring jail and beatings in order to gain the vote. And the goal was largely accomplished finally through the Voting Rights Act of 1965, which in effect enforced both the 15th and the 19th Amendments and drastically changed American politics. Just say this, that we had a major setback when in 2013, Shelby County versus Holder was decided by the Supreme Court, and the crucial part of the Voting Rights Act was struck down. Unfortunately, the court ruled that in the age of Obama, when Americans had elected an African American as president, that federal protection of minority rights was no longer needed. And that has proven to be a huge mistake, in my opinion. The late Ruth Bader Ginsburg, again, my hero, in her dissent, wrote that weakening the essential part of the act when it had worked so well was like throwing away your umbrella in a rainstorm because you're not getting wet. And in many states, serious voter suppression began almost immediately, and we are fighting these battles as a part of this current election. And there are many calls for renewal of the Voting Rights Act, which had been renewed over and over again for so many years by both Republican and Democratic administration. So, in conclusion, it seems as though voting rights are very difficult to gain, and once gained, have to be protected and defended. As I close, let me return to August 26th, the day the 19th Amendment was victorious. In her prepared remarks that Kat delivered that day, rather than thanking the president, members of Congress, or state legislators, she directed her remarks to the women of America, reminding them of the 72 years of struggle by generations of suffragists and the many sacrifices made so that, quote, you and your daughters might inherit political freedom. That vote has been costly, she said. Prize it. Thank you.
Thank you, Marjorie. Dr. Spruill, we really appreciate you taking the time. We have tons of questions out in the field. I have a bunch of questions. I'm going to give it to the field. We have questions from Trieste, from Roma, from Lecce. And what I'd like to do, though, is start with Professora Roberta Modugno, which I believe she has a question for you. And then I'll read the questions from the field.
Yes, I am Roberta Modugno, and I teach history of political thought here at Roma Tre University, but I also teach gender and political theories. And incidentally, I wrote a book on Elizabeth Cady Stanton.
Oh, did you? Wow.
So thank you so much for this detailed and really beautiful lecture, which covered the entire adventure to getting the vote for women in America. But now, yes, I have a question for you. The natural law theory surely played an important role to make women who vindicated the abolition of slavery, to make them self-conscious of their own condition of subjection. But at the same time, natural law, what was really inconsistent theory, because the first theories of natural law excluded women from the political community, as the founding father, as well as the founding father did, of course. But Elizabeth Cady Stanton based her request for a vote for women on natural law theory, among the others arguments, of course. Can you explain this choice, which can seem an inconsistent choice?
Yeah. As you well know, probably more than anyone listening to this today, Elizabeth Cady Stanton was one of the great intellects and philosophers of the women's movement, more than anyone else. And she left behind lots of speeches, testimonies to Congress, and writings in which she put forth her ideas. And as you said, she believed very much in women's individualism and their natural rights, and that those kinds of rights did not belong only to men. And that was a lot of her work, was to try to make women understand that and make the society accept that. Her most famous writing, perhaps, is called The Solitude of Self, in which she talks about, I think it's very moving, because it's saying that, in society, people speak about women always in terms of her relationships to men, and her duties and her role. And then she's going, but you come into this earth alone, you depart alone, your life is as an individual. And basically what the vote was, giving the vote to women, was all about, was stopping considering women as auxiliaries to men, but recognizing them as individuals that had interest of their own that needed to be represented in politics. And she was one of the people who was the best at that.
Okay, thank you. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Spruill. We had several questions that came in that were similar. There was Alessandro Monele asked about the movement with women, and there was questions about racism. So I think you've answered those since the questions came in, but there's a couple of questions that were very unique. One was, what is the role played by the education system in terms of greater gender equity? And that came from Professor Margherita Bruno in Lecce.
I take it you mean the education system currently, in terms of how, or in more recent years, about how it influences people's ideas. One thing that comes to mind instantly is Title IX of the Education Acts of 1972, which that sounds in the weeds, but it was the act that is most well known to people as the one that insisted that women have equal opportunities in sports and results in our great women's soccer team, etc. But what it was a product of the modern wave of the women's movement. And what it did was to bar gender discrimination in education from kindergarten all the way through universities. And so it wasn't just making college football coaches mad because they couldn't spend as much money on that sport. It was about getting rid of gender stereotyped textbooks and literature, getting away from requiring, as it was in my case when I was in 9th grade, all of the girls to take home economics while the boys took general science, and in some places shop. Those kinds of things were gone. So, and there's been a lot of support from the national teachers organizations for, they're very supportive of these changes. But it's interesting that part of the conservative reaction to the women's movement, the one that was led by Phyllis Schlafly, the leading opponent of the ERA, was to oppose this and to accuse everyone from John Dewey all the way up through teachers in the 70s of trying to brainwash children. And she called the denial of one's gender identity as child abuse, which I think was very strong and amazing. So I don't know if that answers your question, but I would say that within American public education system, from the late 60s on at least, that there's been a lot of support for the women's rights ideas, if not explicitly embracing the term feminist or joining any organizations.
Great, thank you for that. I think people are very interested in hearing about Title IX and the education, how education plays a role. We had a question from Marta Lauro Frederico at the University of Naples. This is a big one, but you described that the vote was the big battle, as you said in the presentation. The question is, what is going to be the next big battle for the women's movement? Pay gap, something else? What's your thoughts on that?
That's a very good question at this point, because I think there are going to be a lot of battles, and it's going to be a matter, it's almost difficult to prioritize them, but one that's very much on people's minds again right now, for reasons that you probably realize about the new Supreme Court justice. There's a great deal of concern about reproductive rights and whether or not there will be rollbacks in freedom to choose what to do with one's body, whether it's in vitro fertilization in order to conceive, or whether it's abortion for whatever reason, including to save the life of the mother. So there's a lot of worry in the United States about what this particular justice's views are. She, interestingly, in relation to our lecture today, she's an originalist. She believes that the judges today across the country should not be making legislation, that they should just be interpreting the law to make sure that the points of view of the Supreme Court, of the founding fathers, the people who wrote the Constitution, that we should always be looking back to see what they intended and what they meant, rather than reading into it things that we want to see happen today. So that's become a very big issue. But as you say, Frederica, this is there's so many things, and certainly the issue of equal pay for equal work. Women have made progress in that regard, but we're still not there. And that is also a major issue.
Thank you for that. We had a couple more questions, and then I'll turn the final question over to Dr. Fiorentino and make a few more comments. So are you okay running a little long, Dr. Spruill? Are you?
Absolutely, yes. Okay.
This is a very interesting question. How did the U.S. involvement in World War I further impact the suffrage movement?
It really helped the suffrage movement. The women of the United States, many organized club women in the United States were pacifists and did not want to see that, as was the case in Europe, where women from a number of different countries were trying to do things to avoid the war. And then in the 1920s, were meeting to try to do things to make sure there wouldn't be more war. But when the war came, the fact that Carrie Chapman Catt understood that support for the war effort was going to be a huge positive in the eyes of most Americans, including the very crucial American who sat in the White House. They really urged, her part of the suffrage movement really urged women to be actively involved. Dr. Anna Howard Shaw, the woman who was her predecessor as president of the National American Women's Suffrage Association, took on the job from the government of coordinating all women's war work. And after the war, she was given one of the highest medals that our American military has in payment for that. At the same time, the more militant faction was trying to embarrass Woodrow Wilson, who was portraying himself as the great arbiter who, at the end of the war, wanted to help decide the peace, and very much in favor of self-government. That was his thing. And so for them to go out there and hold up his speeches for self-government and to remind them that one half of the adults in the United States were denied the right to vote, it was very embarrassing for him. So women worked to the war issue to try to get suffrage from both angles, really. And I think that the combination of approaches actually had a great deal of effect. When he actually addressed Congress, calling on them to endorse the federal amendment, he certainly he claimed that he was doing it largely because you don't call on women to work for the nation during war and then not share decision-making with them during the peace.
Great, thank you. That was an excellent answer, very clear. We have a couple more questions. One is the use of the word suffragists and suffragettes. Could you go into a little bit of detail on the difference? And
I wish I could reach it. I have a mug back here on the shelf that one of my students gave me that said, it's suffragist with a G-I-S-T in great big letters, because this is such a thing with me. And every other historian I know of who specializes in women's suffrage. The reason that it bugs us so much when people use the term suffragette is because in this country, it was used almost exclusively to belittle and diminish the suffragists, and they never called themselves that. In England, it was a different matter. The press called them all suffragettes, and the more militant women it actually embraced that term the way sometimes groups embrace some negative term, and used it for themselves. And of course, there was this magnificent movie made a few years ago called Suffragette. And when I heard about that, I thought, oh, but it's all lost. We're never going to get past it now. And of course, it's just a really, really common error. And it wouldn't bother me at all, except for the fact that it's like, calling socialist pinkos or some smear word about toward African Americans that we don't use. I just don't believe that we ought to be calling people things that were the terms used to make women who wanted suffrage appear to be childish, selfish, neglectful of their homes, not knowing what they were doing, like children. And that was what the detractors meant when they used that word.
Thank you. Very interesting, because I think many of us, even if we grew up, the difference. And I'm reading a book right now, actually, about revolutionary women who rode bicycles, and they equate a lot of the movement of being able to ride a bicycle in public to the right to vote.
Yes.
They talk about suffragettes in England as kind of the more radical. So I'm going to have one more question and then turn it over to Dr. Fiorentino and then finish with some comments. But Here's a question from American Corner Trieste, and American Corners are partners that are cultural centers, American cultural centers that work with the embassy. What happened to the Susan B. Anthony dollar coin, and what's going on with the proposed Tubman $20 paper bill?
The Susan B. Anthony coin came out in 1979 during the Jimmy Carter administration. And Carter, in fact, just did a lot of things to try to increase the numbers of women federal judges and more in his cabinet than previously. And so, one of the things that he was doing was reaching out to women and to honor the women's movement by having that coin made. Now, the unfortunate thing was that coin, it was $1, worth $1, but it was the size of a quarter. And aside from those of us who grabbed them up or whose parents gave them to them for Christmas or everything because they knew we would like that, a lot of the American public did not take to it. And so they stopped minting it about 4 years later. Then for some reason, they did another minting of it in 1999, but haven't been since. So now it's a real collector's item. They later replaced it with a image of Sacagawea, who was a Native American woman who accompanied and helped guide Lewis and Clark in their famous exposition in the early 1800s across the United States. So she was on it. But in general, women have been very in short supply when it comes to any kind of U.S. Currency. And so that was why a few years ago, there was this huge movement. That idea is still out there, but it hasn't been implemented. Of Harriet Tubman going on the $20 bill to replace Andrew Jackson. It still very well might happen in the future. We'll see.
Thank you for that. I just one comment on that. Those coins are widely used still in Ecuador. So if anybody wants to get some of those coins, take them to Ecuador. Strangely, they're using them as their tender. So Dr. Fiorentino, would you like to say a couple of words, and then I'll wrap it up at the end?
Thank you. Yeah, just a few words. Well, first of all, I want to thank Marjorie for a beautiful, very interesting, dense, I would say, lecture. I was thinking, and I'd like to hear your comments on this, that especially toward the end of your presentation, how you underlined the continuing battle that that women's vote, of course, entails, which is part and parcel of democracy, I would say. I mean, democracy, it's not a perfect system, very difficult to maintain and to keep up, and always in need of repair. I would say that from this point of view, women's suffrage is the ultimate in maintaining democratic rights, keeping them up. It's not something we should ever give for granted because it's a continuous struggle. And it is even more now, as you underlined, the switch, the change from your hero, I would say the hero of many of us, Ruth Bader Ginsburg, and the new Supreme Court Justice, Amy Coney Barrett. I think that many students would like to hear about this, more recent current change that is taking place in the United States, and to what extent this could affect democracy and women's rights. I want to thank also the embassy, of course, the Public Affairs Office, and Sheila Weir for this wonderful opportunity they gave us. Thank you. Have a good evening. And say hello to Don for me.
I will. He's listening.
Oh, okay. Hello, Don. I'm sorry, but we've known each other for quite a while. So thank you, Marjorie.
And I hope to being here, being part of this.
I hope to see you in Rome physically soon. Okay.
Me too. Very much so.
Thank you.
Dr. Spruill, do you have any final comments before I wrap up the program?
I just would like to underscore what Daniele just said. Don't forget that you promised to bring me over there when this is all over.
We'll do our best. And we're going to have the presentation, just so everyone knows, we will have a video recording of the presentation available. So that will be available on our website afterwards. There was one final question that I want to ask you before my final remarks, but when do you think we'll have the United States will have the first woman president?
That is something that it's hard to say. It's something, it seems to me that we just, not only because the woman who just ran 4 years ago and got, the most votes did not get to be president, again, because of our peculiarities of our federal system, in which the Electoral College gives states particular weight rather than individuals. And so whoever gets the most individual votes does not necessarily get the presidency. But I think that there was the fact that there were so many misogynist attacks on her during that time, despite the fact that she did succeed in getting the most votes. There are a lot of Americans today who think that because she lost, that it's dangerous to nominate a woman to be president. And so I fear that it may be a while. I hope I'm wrong. Now, having said that, the Republican Party could very well nominate a woman, a conservative woman like Nikki Haley, who is the former governor of my state. And so the world U.S. politics is always full of surprises. And I think it's just as likely that the first president who's a female, when it comes, is going to come from the Republican Party as from the Democratic Party, even though the Democratic Party has far more women in elective office. And that's been a trend now for some time. But it's anybody's guess. We don't know how it's going to turn out next week, let alone in the future. So I don't know.
Very good point, and a great to end on, and a great commentary to end on. I would really like to thank you and all of our special guests and participants and all the questions that came in. If you have any other ideas for programs that you'd like to see, please talk to your embassy and consulates, because we'd love to continue this Transatlantic Thursdays and make them relevant to the conversations that are going on at both countries. We have a couple of upcoming events. November 5th, 2 days after the election, we are going to have a program on the US elections. And this program will be in Italian language. It'll talk about what happens between Election Day and Inauguration Day, and it's focused on the process. And then following that, there'll be on November 12th, there will be a program on studying in the USA and International Education Week that the Fulbright Commission will deliver. Thank you all for watching. Alla prossima, and have a good day, and we'll hopefully talk to you soon and see you soon. Thank you very much.
Thank you.